And we're back with Nate Turner, who's here to talk to us today about socialism, as well as related topics. How you doing, Nate?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. All right, so as usual, our first question is, what got you interested in following the intellectual dark web and got you to be a member of our community?
Yeah, certainly. I think this definitely stems back to my intro into politics. So I first started getting into politics towards, I think, the end of the 2016 campaign. I stayed up all night watching the election results, and I kind of was introduced to characters like Milo Yiannopoulos. I was introduced to characters like Ben Shapiro, and that just kind of grew and grew and grew into all these different personalities. And one of the big characters that I met, got introduced to, I suppose, was Jordan Peterson. So I saw his first video on, I think it was like that trans rights C-16 bill, where he was like speaking out publicly, and there are these protesters against him. And that really got me infatuated with the whole Jordan Peterson movement. I bought his book. I actually got to go see one of his shows this past September. I got to meet him in person. It was a really great thing. And through him and through Shapiro and through all these different people, I met like a whole bunch of different people. I met the Weinsteins. I saw Sam Harris, just all these different groups of intellectuals who want to have a discussion on free speech, individuality. It was a really great thing for me, and is helping me kind of shape my perspective a lot too.
Okay, well, that's great to hear. All right, so let's get right into it. You want to talk today about socialism. I think the first thing to do, though, is establish what we mean by the term socialism, because I do think there's a very broad sense in which the term is applied, and there's a narrow sense in which the term is applied. And you can have situations like Bernie Sanders, for example, who will say, I'm a democratic socialist, and then you'll have some people say, well, he's not really a socialist, he's using the term incorrectly. And so there's that debate in the air about what the term means. Can you establish for our purposes today what you mean when you talk about socialism?
So what I mean, so I'm doing a bit of research into socialism myself. So I always think that it's important to settle on definitions, because definitions do matter in the end. So I pulled off of Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of socialism, any of various economic and political theories advocating for collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. And then there wasn't a definition for democratic socialism, which is a very popular, I would say, derivative of socialism. So I think I found it off of Wikipedia. So political philosophy that advocates for political democracy alongside social ownership of the means of production, with an emphasis on self-management and democratic management of the economic institutions within a market or some form of decentralized planned socialist economy. So it's basically, it is quite literally socialism, but democratic. So people vote on how they're going to distribute the means instead of leaving it up to government to decide it for them.
So it would be the economic system of, say, the Soviets, but without the necessarily repressive authoritarian system of the Soviets, one might say.
I don't know if it necessarily implies. I would assume for myself that that kind of economic system turns to something authoritarian, but I don't think with the definition it automatically asserts that this is going to be an authoritarian regime, because you have things like libertarian socialism, which is the exact opposite of that. It's a bunch of people going together, like I'd kind of say the Amish. It's like a community of people, and they all distribute things according to what they need, how stuff like that.
Okay. So that's a good starting point. So what examples of socialist societies do you think we currently see today? Obviously, we can't talk about the Soviet Union anymore because it collapsed, but I assume countries like Cuba, North Korea would fall under the socialism as you're explaining it, as at least as obvious extreme examples.
Mm-hmm. So I think the big socialist one right now is Venezuela. Venezuela is a pretty big one. I don't know too much about Cuba myself, and I think I would put North Korea more as like more of a authoritarian dictatorship. And you also have, I would think the Bernie Sanders left would say something along the lines of the Nordic countries are socialist, but they're not really socialist. They're social democracies. So they have a pretty big social safety net. But on the same side, they have very little regulations, like their business world is doing great. They have no minimum wage, stuff along those lines. But I definitely say that Venezuela, Cuba, those would be modern day socialist countries.
Okay. So a lot of people do view the Nordic countries as examples of socialism. But you noted that there's a difference between social safety nets and having some social programs and being socialist. So you wouldn't view something like the U.S. Post Office as an example of socialism?
No, I'd probably think of that as a baseline kind of government service. I wouldn't necessarily say that as socialism. I hear that a lot with like the police are socialists, the roads are socialist. I don't necessarily think I agree with that. It's kind of a baseline of what government should provide. It's like an emergency service that everyone is able to rely on, no matter if you're rich or poor. It's not the government kind of having a monopoly on the issue. Because you have, in the police, for instance, you have the option of hiring private security, or you can have a gun at your house to protect yourself. With the case of, I would say, the post office, you have alternatives like FedEx, you have Amazon, you have UPS, and with roads, I mean, you can have a private road.
Right. Okay. Well, so these are some good borders to establish. So, having done that, can you explain to me, I assume, what your concerns are about socialism, particularly in the modern day?
Well, I guess like the main thing that I would say is that socialism just doesn't plain out work. It's all based on a planned economy, which historically has never worked. You can look at China, you can look at the USSR, you can look at places like Venezuela. They also do things like price fixing, which hasn't worked. That's why the oil industry has collapsed in Venezuela. I think like the rise of socialism is just a rise of ignorance towards economics in general. People aren't really entirely sure on how economics works. They just feel that, oh, I feel bad for this person, so let's do this. It's kind of like a short-term solution, but it doesn't really work in the long term.
Right, I see what you're saying. There's a lot of this is a visceral reaction to real injustices that are being observed, and so there's an attempt to develop a solution to it, but the solution is short-sighted and a bit ham-fisted, and that's essentially what you're saying is the issue with socialism right now.
I think, yeah, it's definitely that, and I can understand you want to have a gut reaction and you want to do something with a problem immediately, but you have to look at what most of these people do is they just look at this one group for this one short span of time, and they don't look at every single group for the long span of time, which is arguably a lot more important than just one group at one time. I would say with like the minimum wage, you have a bunch of poor people who aren't getting paid what they think that they deserve. And some people say that a good solution would be raising the minimum wage, but I would say in the end, employers would be absolutely screwed by this. They could just lay off workers, they could cut hours, and you're leaving and you're cutting out the workers who aren't worth that much in an employer's eyes, so they won't get hired in the first place because it's too expensive to hire this person because they don't produce at the rate that we are forced to pay them.
Right. I noticed there are varied effects that come with minimum wage increases. I'm mostly optimistic about those, but one of the effects that I think is what you're noting here is that where there are new jobs created, they're often not the jobs that you were trying to raise the wage for. They simply create more positions that would have had that higher level of pay anyway, so they can get that level of value out of it, and they reduce the number of positions that were previously paid below the minimum wage. That's one effect that's been noted in certain businesses. Let's say we raise the minimum wage, from what it currently is, $7.25 to $15 an hour, right?
Yeah.
So there are certain jobs that are already paid $15 an hour. There are certain jobs that are paid minimum wage, and there are certain jobs within single companies that are, well, there'll be single companies where they pay one position minimum wage and another position $15 an hour, or the equivalent of $15 an hour. So what they'll do in that situation is they'll just reduce the number of minimum wage jobs that are now meant to be 15 and create more positions that were previously already being paid roughly 15 an hour. That's an effect that's been noted in some cases with minimum wage increases. We've seen a bit of that, for example, with the current effort in Seattle. Were you getting at were you sort of noting on that effect? Because it seemed like you were. Maybe you were talking about something else.
Kind of. I think it's more of, there are definitely some like low-skilled people who don't have the necessary skills to be able to get a job that's $15 an hour. You're effectively leaving those people out by raising the minimum wage, so employers just won't hire them to begin with, and then they won't get those skills, and then they're going to be screwed, and then people will just say, oh, let's force these people to give these people jobs, even though they'll be running at a loss. I think this is like pretty well documented. I remember hearing this from so when the minimum wage was first implemented, before it was first implemented, black teen unemployment and white teen unemployment were effectively the same. The unemployment rates were effectively the same for black teens and white teens. But once the minimum wage got passed, black teens got left off in the dust because they don't have any marketable skills to be able to work. They're not worth being paid the minimum wage because they don't have any skills, because they're poor. And so from that, after the minimum wage was implemented, black teen unemployment skyrocketed. I think I think I saw Larry Elder talk about this a little bit ago, and he said that there was I don't want to just pull numbers out of my butt, but I think like 50,000 jobs were lost. Like they were just pulled from these black teen communities. I also read this in Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell, and yeah.
Okay, this is all very interesting. I think I might want to put a pin in it for now. I still want to talk about more, I guess, overarching questions before we get on to more specific prescriptions like this. But you mentioned just a moment ago that you think that socialism as an economic construct necessarily leads to authoritarian systems like we saw with the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin. Could you elaborate why you think that is?
Well, I think the thing with that is you're ceding a lot of power to a central government, and they'll be able to do as they want. They're not going to give their power back because they have all the power in the world. You're not going to get some kind of benevolent. You're not going to get a benevolent guy in there. Eventually, you'll get the tyrant who wants to send you into camps, send you into the trains, send you into the labor camps, and do all that stuff. So that's what I think socialism is doing. You're ceding a lot of power to some entity, whether it be the state or whether it be the mob in general. So like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a state. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Stalin to bring this about. It could be like the majority plus one. The majority plus one can rule, and they can take away the rights of everyone else in order to bring about this authoritarianism, I would say.
Right, that makes a lot of sense as far as I can tell, because I mean, when you centralize the economy like that, when you centralize the flow of wealth under a handful, even a single person like that is a lot of power to give people. I do think that it is often underestimated how much wealth can easily translate into political power. There's raw political power, as in that you have a right to say veto XYZ. Then there's more de facto political power that comes from what other forms of influence you have, like your wealth or like your fame. And I think that's one thing where Joseph Stalin might have only had certain explicit powers granted to him based on the governmental structure of the Soviet Union, but the control of the wealth in that manner clearly radiated into much more realistic power. And so I think there's a good argument that it can very easily lead to authoritarianism. And I think you might be sort of building up to how, at least currently, what we're seeing in Venezuela is. Do you think that's an example of that at work?
Yeah. So the history of Venezuela, it started out with I think it was the oil industry. They nationalized the oil industry, and I think it was 70% of their economy was running off of just oil. And then once the economy collapsed, everything just went to crap. And it was it was the fault of the government for not, I would say, most of its, I think exports were coming from oil. And once the oil prices collapsed, the government just collapsed. I definitely think that's like a big fault of the government for nationalizing that in the first place, and not having some kind of proper backing in a bunch of different industries to keep you alive when there's an inevitability of oil crashing.
Right. What we see in a lot of the Arabian countries.
They're pretty big oil.
Yeah, they're pretty big oil, but they're also developing their other sectors with the gains of that oil. So you don't hear about Dubai collapsing as oil went down, because Dubai has established other things that make its country sustainable. I mean, no doubt that this hasn't been great for Dubai, but it's not a disaster like it's been in Venezuela.
Yeah, certainly.
All right, and so I guess the question here is, like, what is the fine line between what government should do and should be able to control or regulate and what it should not? Because, as you mentioned just a moment ago, there are baseline things like a post office, like kindergarten, like the military and the police and the fire department, and these are all things that we consider just a basic part of any enlightened 21st century society. You'd be unthinkful to say, well, let's get rid of those things, given the benefits they have. But there is the observation that if you give the government control of everything, if you completely erase the idea of a private sector and make everything public, that's definitely too far. I guess the question is, what would be the point of no return where we have fundamentally erred? Is it would something like Medicare for all, or a nationalized system for funding health? Because I do think that it's important to make the distinction between that and the actual health care itself being nationalized. Do you think that's an example of crossing the line? Some think that it is. Some disagree. And then the same could be said of, say, making public college the norm. Having tuition-free public college and just guaranteeing it. Are these examples that you think are too far or not?
So I think it's important to kind of start from zero and then move our way up. So I think with military, I think that's probably like the backbone of where to start. I think that there's a lot of issue with having a privatized military, because you could have different military groups going off against each other. That's kind of a fear that like the founding fathers represented within the what is it? Oh, geez, I forget what it was called. I'm in the middle of the book, but the Federalist Papers.
Yes.
Yeah, they're talking about how the government should be solely responsible for dictating the military, because if you were to just leave it up to private groups, there could be like some kind of scare of warfare, intergroup turmoil, stuff along those lines. So I think it's safe to say that you should put military in the hands of the government. In the case of, I would say, I think the next step, police, firefighters, it's really important to have that kind of stuff, because that's life-saving in a sense. And I'd also say the same for emergency services, like if you got shot and the guy left and you need a hospital, you should have that emergency service and to be able to help you in that dire condition, because otherwise you're screwed. And that helps I would say it helps it helps everyone generally, but probably more like poor people, because they can't get access to a lot of the stuff richer people can. But there is a distinction, I think I laid this out earlier, of you can have a private entity do something better, but you still want to have like a bare bones safety net that's kind of a last resort for people if they need it. I think a last resort is great in the case of police. I think that's great in the case of firefighting. In education, I would also say, the same for housing, at least on a local level, and healthcare. So like broadline police for everyone to use, and if you didn't want to use the police, you can hire like a private security firm, or you can keep a gun in your house for safety, because keeping a private gun is a lot better. It saves a lot more lives than waiting for the police to come there. And firefighting, you can have like a fire extinguisher in your home instead of waiting for the firefighters there, but the firefighters are still like a great alternative if you're in a pinch, you don't have a fire extinguisher, whatever. With healthcare, it's good to have emergency services for very, very baseline stuff and life-threatening stuff. But if you want to have like the best quality of care of best cheap prices, you want to move to a private system because private systems usually create that kind of stuff. It does it with food, it does it with household appliances, it does it with technology, all these things. So you kind of want a safety net of a public emergency system for everyone to use if the situation were to arise where it needed to be used. But you still want to improve the quality and the price of a private industry that just makes everything better if you're able to afford it. And it gets increasingly so affordable with the private market. And I definitely say the same for education too. So like I think a public school is good in the sense that people should be getting educated. I don't think that that's the only mode that you can do. You don't need to go to university to study. You can go to a trade school, you can go to a community college, or you can just go to a job right out of high school. But that public option should be an option for if you have like a kind of last resort. But if you want to ramp up the quality and lower the price, you want a market in that place. I think the best case of this is actually in Switzerland. I hear a lot about Switzerland's healthcare system in this sense, and maybe it should be implemented in the education system as well, where you have a private system competing against the public system. So the public system is free for everyone to use, and it's like a quality comparable to the private system, but the private system is going to be better, but at a slightly higher price.
Okay, well that's very thorough. I think if I were to describe what the system you laid out offers, it's this. It's and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like by allowing public resources, by guaranteeing certain public resources, you're able to prevent catastrophic disaster in some cases for the economy. If several, for example, poor people suddenly had their lives ruined because they encountered problems that they lacked the economic means to solve, you suddenly have a lot of households go under that. Ultimately, more successful individuals in an economy depend on for their own success. Mm-hmm. The typical ripple effect of any recession, you might say, is at work there. And then, so that's the advantage of a public option. It guarantees some stability in the business cycle by preventing one of the beams of the economy from busting and bringing the building down. And then the advantage of preserving a private sector to go farther is it allows us to improvise. So where a centrally planned economy doesn't give room for creativity, especially as new problems emerge that entrepreneurs can solve, a private sector does do that. It allows for innovation and creative problem solving to be utilized and factored into the new wealth of an economy. Is that basically what how you would describe the advantages of the system you're laying out?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, well, good. All right, so I think the next thing that comes to mind is what you say. It involves some level of optimism about what government is able to do in terms of providing services. There are many on the political right who would not share that view. There are many on the political right, and then certainly libertarians, who would really strip the government down to basic
kind of bare bones operations
and protection, right? Like so, military, policing, things like that. I mean, there were some who would even oppose the idea of public school K-12. Those are the most extreme examples, but there's that general school of thought about government that it's not good at providing any kind of goods. I mean, what do you make of all of that?
So, I think I would describe myself as a conservative libertarian, and I am very sympathetic to the argument that government sucks at pretty much everything it does, and it should only be its bare bones operations. But once again, there is the issue of people being left behind. I don't think I have the perfect solution to that. A lot of people on the right say, let's help the communities out. Let's let the churches deal with this. Let's help boost private charities. Because once again, the government isn't the best solution to that. And I think this goes back to what I was saying. It's like you have kind of a short term, you have a short term solution that is kind of instinctual, and then you have a long term solution that's going to take a long, hard line of work to be able to fix. I think what the right wants is that hard fix. So you want the long, drawn-out process of fixing society to the point where we do care about our communities, we do care about getting them healthcare, we do care about getting them educated. But that's going to take a lot of effort to put into place. You're not going to effectively change people's minds within the next 5 or 10 years and suddenly convince them that, hey, just go to your communities for help if you need help. You have this like massive, I would say like cultural brainwashing of like the government is supposed to take care of us. Contrast that with like 50 years ago where it was your communities that took care of you. And that's what I think it's the community's job to be able to take care of you, your friends, your family, your church, whatever. The government shouldn't be the one to step in, but unfortunately it is. And if you have that kind of, you have the government stepping in to take care of people at kind of a baseline level, I think that's fine to have them take care of them at a baseline level. And at the same time, you can build up your communities to be able to help get them the good kind of healthcare, the good kind of education, the good kind of housing, the good kind of food. And it's a really difficult process to be able to kind of put that into policy or no policy, like just changing people's minds on that subject.
Right. Yes, I agree. And then I think the work that it would take to develop our society into the one that conservatives want it to be, where communities look after each other in terms of sense of interdependent private obligations, would take a long time. And until you get there, you have a lot of problems that aren't going to be solved for individuals.
And it's kind of hard for people to just wait for something good to happen. Right. They want that immediate solution.
Yeah. You'd have to sacrifice a lot of pawns to get to that checkmate. And unfortunately, in the real world, the pawns aren't irrelevant. And it's a form of chess where the sacrifice actually hurts, even if you do win.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some issues with that I think apply to the socialism as well. But this is where it comes out with, I think, the more right-wing perspective. But it sounds to me that you're effectively advocating for a kind of mixed economy, where we take the advantages that come from the public sector, we take the advantages that come from the private sector, and try to utilize both concurrently, effectively giving us some sort of economic system that lies somewhere in the center. Would you say that's what's going on there?
I don't know if I'm necessarily advocating for a mixed economy. I do see the virtue in having some kind of baseline operations to be able to help people. But I want the market to be able to perform at its best as efficiently as possible, because it does wondrous things. It reduces poverty, it makes things cheap, and it makes things really good quality. I'd definitely say, well, I guess in the case of Switzerland, again, or the Nordic countries, they have a pretty vast social safety net, and they have very loose regulations on business that allows their economy to grow. That's why they're doing better than us. They're a lot more they're economically freer than us the last time I checked. And they kind of have like a high, I don't really know how to put this. Like they're generally like happier than us with the kind of stuff that they have. But I also think it's like it's a cultural thing too. because like they're pretty culturally homogenous in these Nordic countries. I think that's why they're able to let this go so well for them. They're able to have those kind of social safety nets. They are able to have that kind of mixed economy, so like a pretty unregulated market, but also have a pretty robust social safety net. I think it's also a thing of like the U.S. We're not culturally the same. We don't all think the same. We don't think that like America's great. We don't think that we all don't share the same values, and I think that kind of detriments us in the end because we all want different things, and those different things lead to drastically different outcomes. Yeah, that's how I put. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think there's probably some truth in the whole the perspective of it's easier to want to be willing to invest in programs that are serving a more homogeneous society. I mean, you'll meet people who will think, well, you just want to give handouts to lazy black people. And I know that's sort of a trope of a conservative, and I want to make sure that I'm not writing off all conservatives like that. That said, I have met conservatives multiple times in person who have said just that kind of thing. And so, I mean, that's sort of, to me, an example of something that probably isn't occurring in Sweden, because that's not a demographic statement that one Swede could make about their welfare system. Because it's mostly just Swedes in Sweden. And most of the non-Swedes are probably other Europeans. So it's not quite, it's apples to oranges in terms of what our demographic background is that is going to be the recipient of these welfare or social programs.
Certainly. And I think a big thing also is like population differences. Mm-hmm. Like they're pretty small countries, like 8 million or something along those lines, and we have 325 million. I think that's a pretty big factor to play in as well. Like there's a cultural aspect and then there's a population aspect.
Well, that is interesting because some people have argued that our size would make a lot of these social programs harder to develop. Now, I actually don't think there's a good argument for that myself. Generally, as you increase scale, you increase the savings and efficiency. So you have more of that. And one thing that is true of these Nordic countries is that they do tend to be relatively resource-rich for their population size. But this is also largely true of the United States. And then the United States also has other economic advantages that other countries don't have that are of comparable size. The U.S. economy has a much more centralized role in the global economy. There are absolute benefits that come with that. And a big country like China or a big country like Russia doesn't have that in the same way.
I think also the military is a pretty big thing too. So like the U.S. has the biggest military out of any other country in the world. Like I think our military spending is as much as the next 20 combined. And a lot of these countries aren't paying for militaries because they're just relying off the U.S. to spend off of them. So then they're able to afford all these social safety programs.
Well, what's one of the hidden gems of the U.S. military budget, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people on, we'll say in the Democratic Party, who criticize the size of the military budget don't get is, a lot of that budget isn't necessarily on weapons and imperialistic ventures, but it's on infrastructure. It's on housing in military communities. It's on healthcare for servicemen and for veterans. And it's a lot of what is left of the New Deal survives in the American military, interestingly enough. It's a subsidy to demand, to put it in very strict Keynesian terms. And there's that as well. That's about the only way you can really get a lot of those programs these days is if you simply make it a part of the military budget, and then you can get some conservative votes that you might not otherwise get if you gave it a more civilian era.
That's actually pretty interesting. I didn't hear about that, about like just putting money into the military and then people will just vote on it because it's the military.
And this is an interesting thing, and this is why, again, you never want to sell conservatives short. Is they can agree with Democrats on some things. It's just you have to make it aligned with their goals and values, right? So conservatives have a lot more respect for authority. There's this idea on the left that authority is bad because they think of oppression. But conservatives realize authority gives us a uniting force for some common good, like safety and protection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, and so they can look at putting stuff into the military and say, well, this is helping keep America safe and strong. Why not promote this? Why not incentivize people to join the military by offering these perks? There's a good argument for that. So, of course, conservatives are going to get on board with that kind of stuff. And, what's interesting is when you provide these economic benefits to people in the military, it will spill over into benefits for civilians in the economy. It's just the nature of money, right? The multiplier effect. And so you can get a lot of what you would want in terms of economic development through the military budget, which we rather often do. And unfortunately, I think what a lot of Democrats don't realize is we can cut the budget, but a lot of that's going to go too if we do that. Sure, we might be less imperialistic and we can feel better about ourselves doing that, maybe. But there's also that consequence that will come with it. And I don't know that liberals are fully aware of that or ready to grasp it if they are, or ready to grapple with it if they are, if we ever get to that point, where we're doing that, where that becomes a matter of American policy. But that's the sort of thing that I see there is. I think where people might do. So you've established that we need a baseline.
Yes.
And what that baseline is subject to debate. And it seems to me like whatever you think the baseline is might be what you might define as the border between socialism and not socialism. And what I think is important is, I think what we need to do is simply, I think what liberals really need to do is do a better job making their case of why certain baselines, say a higher baseline, makes sense to conservative voters and thinkers in general. Because I don't think they've been doing a good job of it. And I think again, like we see with the military example, there are reasons why a higher baseline is not only consistent with the values of conservatives, but in some ways it can enable markets. Again, I'm a pretty standard Keynesian, and I think that the government can do something to subsidize demand and promote spending. That spills over into other businesses. And if you're growing the private sector, that has to be good for anyone who wants to see more private sector activity going.
Yeah, certainly. I think with the government incentives thing, I think that there would be like a perverse people to kind of maximize their gains in a way that tilts the markets into something that's not a market. Like I would say like the government bailouts of like the big banks, that was a pretty bad thing.
I was sensing that was coming up, right? And their situation was they had every reason to do what they did because they knew that Uncle Sam would come to the rescue if things got truly bad. And so you can incentivize good things, like incentivize people go out and eating at their local pizza place, and which gives economic activity to local small businesses. But then you can also incentivize bad things, like we can cheat because the government has said they will rescue us.
Certainly. I think it's a lot of people putting it out there as we're going to incentivize a good thing, but it usually turns out to be, there are these people that are gaining the system using this incentive, so we have to do something about that.
So what is the solution to that, maybe? Because on the one hand, we don't want to incentivize that, but on the other hand, to allow the collapse of our financial sector like that would have been unthinkable. As bad as the bailouts were, as hard of a pill to swallow as that was, it's hard to imagine how simply ignoring the issue and letting it unfold to its gravest outcome would have been better. What can we do about that? Because if the banks are the heart of the economy that pumps the blood throughout the whole system. You let that fail, you're basically saying we can't have an economy. Mm-hmm. But there has to be a way in which we can keep a failure from happening, and reasonably say, well, we'll prevent it from happening, but also not create toxic incentives. What do you think we need to do about that?
$1 million question right there. I think it might be situational. I think it might be.
Spoken like a true private sector advocate.
Ain't it amazing?
Yeah.
But I think the thing with the big banks, they were kind of backed into a corner where, okay, if we don't bail them out, then everything is absolutely screwed. So we have to kind of look back to where the point of no return was. And it's really hard to say where that is. I'm not an economics expert. I don't really know all too much about the bailouts. But generally, as a principle, I think that like the government handouts of like I think like government funding of some like private business that tends to put that in favor of the business receiving the money, and then it kind of locks out the rest of the competition. So you have these like big tech monopolies that are giving government dollars, and they're trying to push this legislation. They're trying to do all these things so competitors can't rise up. Like you see Google, Facebook, Twitter, all these companies in favor of net neutrality. It won't affect them, but it'll 100% affect like all their competitors like Bing or any other social network that can't handle that kind of stuff. So
Right.
it's kind of hard when you have you kind of have, in a sense, I'm giving money to this guy's succeeding, and now this guy is going to perverse the government in a sense to stop the market from doing what it's supposed to do, and it lets this company become essentially a government-sponsored monopoly.
Right. So one of the critiques you often hear of capitalism by people on the left is in basically a situation where you accrue enough wealth and therefore enough de facto political power is that market originating entities can use their wealth to manipulate the government and therefore pervert the market system itself to favor them. And this is sort of the classic problem that occurs with monopolies, as you pointed out. But they're basically shanghaiing the government to make this happen. And I think a lot of this ultimately comes down to the problem that Bernie Sanders highlighted with the money being such a big thing in American politics. I mean, what are your views on that? Do we need to clamp down on money in politics in order to get the kind of market system that we truly want?
I'm a pretty big guy of I can put my money wherever I darn well please, but I definitely do see some trouble in doing that. So I remember there's like a big debate in conservative circles on what to do about money in politics, because like that's a pretty big thing, and it kind of relates to big tech in a way too, because all these giant companies are going after conservatives, and there's nothing that you can really do except sit there and take it or regulate it. And with the money in politics thing, I can understand that there are interest groups that only want to vie for the interest groups, and that creates maybe some laws that only benefit them, and then it detriments a whole bunch of other people. I think with that, I don't even know if I'm going to take this stance, but I'll probably just say it. I don't think that we should have companies donating to these government entities or politicians, something along those lines. I can understand like individual people, because I don't think that makes too much of a difference. But if you have these companies with the wealth accumulated to be able to push the agenda that they want, I can see that as pretty troublesome.
Okay. So I imagine, though, we need to draw a line, if only for the purpose of ethics in government. Because there's not only the issue of how is this affecting our ability to have real functioning fair markets, but there's also the are we subverting our democracy in the process? Because I think those are the two things we want. We want markets and we want democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we allow individuals to do what they want, I can imagine that even among people who are pretty far on the right, there would be an enormously negative reaction if, say, Bill Gates went on TV and said, and just wrote a check for $1 million, and he says, and there's Nancy Pelosi right next to him, and he's like, I'm giving her $1 million, and she has promised to lip support for this bill that I want. That's the deal we're making. And from a first principles point of view, one might say that's Bill doing whatever he damn well pleases with his money as an individual. But I think most of us would have the sense that this is not how government, democracy especially, should work, where you can just write Nancy Pelosi a check and explicitly in exchange for the passage of a bill. I mean, where is the line on issues like that?
Maybe that's where campaign finance laws comes into effect, so you can only donate like a certain amount to any political candidate. Like, I don't know what the cap is. I think it's like $10,000 or something per one political candidate, or $5,000, something along those lines. Maybe a cap would be a good thing. I don't see money as too much of persuasion on an individual level basis if you have some sort of cap. But if you have these organizations with their political action committees, that could definitely lead to some trouble down the road, because they can donate. I don't even know how much some political action committees donate. I know unions donates a lot. Like some big liberals like Soros, Koch brothers, the big boogeymen of political action committees. They donate a lot of money. Maybe a cap would be a good idea for that, because then it wouldn't sway too many decisions on that.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about, I think, just general ideas, big picture stuff, a lot of theory. I want us to start talking about some predictions and anticipations going forward. So, keeping to the topic of socialism, I suspect there is some concern about what the current uptick in activity on the far left, maybe even the fact that we actually now seem to have something that can be considered a far left, particularly in American politics. Mm-hmm. What is your take on all of that? For example, I mean, do you see that there was some? I look at the Bernie Sanders campaign as mostly a good thing. Some people see that and worry that socialism is coming to take over the country. Some people might not see that in the Bernie Sanders campaign, but they might see it in something else like democratic socialism in America. What are your thoughts on the current trends of far left in American politics? Are they worrisome or not?
It's hard to say. Because I try to follow socialist circles as much as I can, and I see a lot of them kind of vying for these really, really radical positions, like the Green New Deal. I would consider Medicare for all. That I would consider free college. That I don't know if those are gaining too much traction. You see a bunch of people saying, "Oh man, I really support that," on paper. Like, or if you ask someone like, "Are you in favor of the Green New Deal?" They'll say yes. Like 70% of people will say yes. But then you ask them like, "What do you think of your taxes being raised to be able to pay for it?" No, people are not on board for that kind of stuff. So I think that there are still like sane, middle of the road people who are like, "I'm not going to pay for this. I like the idea, but I'm not willing to pay for it." I think that's kind of a crutch of the left right now. And it's also like, I see this within the Democratic Party too, with the election going on. You kind of have like an extreme policy side, and you have like an extreme intersectional side. A lot of what I found like really interesting, I've been like reading books on socialism, and it has a lot to do with like intersectional liberation. And you're seeing a lot of these socialists kind of vie for that intersectionality card. But like, as you get more radical in the policy, and as you get more radical in the intersectionality, a lot less people are going to be on board with you. That's why you see Biden doing so well, because he's polling well with like middle America, and you're not seeing someone like you see Bernie Sanders is like a second, but he's like, everyone loves Bernie Sanders because he loves free weed, free college, free healthcare. But you see like other socialist candidates not doing as well. And I think you're seeing like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her popularity polls are going down, I believe, the last time I checked.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at that. I don't think she's as gifted at messaging as, say, someone like Bernie for the kind of agenda she wants.
Mm-hmm.
But that passing mention aside, it does seem to me though that as you get more radical, in some ways you're even moving away from the scope of socialism itself. I mean, you look at the intersectional stuff, for example. I mean, socialism is at its core an economic system, right? It's a prescription for how an economy should function. And when you focus on intersectional identity stuff, you're moving away from that conversation. And I think even the socialists at that point, particularly the ones who have been into it, going back decades now, don't really know what to make of that. It's not something that is going to get them excited, right?
I don't know. Well, I think, once again, I've been keeping tabs on a lot of socialist stuff, and one of the big things that they talk about is oppression, and that links up to this intersectionality thing, because women are oppressed, minorities are oppressed, gay people are oppressed, trans people are oppressed, and it kind of goes back into that. It's kind of like a cultural socialism in a sense. It's completely ignoring the economic side of it, but is instead going towards the cultural shift, I would say.
Right. It's sort of looking at the mathematical framework of socialism and substituting we'll say class variables with identity variables in that way.
Certainly, yeah. I think class, maybe it's half class structures. I think the big driving thing for socialists is rich versus poor kind of dynamic, but you also have a lot to play in the what is it, the straight white man versus the gay black woman, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that is one of the interesting things about me, about the development of the more far left stuff that we've seen lately, and how it can be hit or miss with some people on the American political left, which is a very large spectrum of people. Now, I've actually joined DSA recently.
Okay.
This is largely out of curiosity. I'm trying to see what exactly they as an organization are going to try and do. I don't know. My general impression is they haven't quite found their identity yet as far as what their mission is. I think just because especially since they've recently gotten a lot of new people who are just spillover from the Bernie Sanders campaign and people who were made aware of DSA by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez winning her primary.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I have noticed is that there is some of that intersectional stuff in there, but for example, at the start of the meeting, they have everyone introduce themselves and say, what are your pronouns? And there aren't very many places where people will start affairs with that. But they'll do that at DSA meetings. And, they have also what they call the progressive speaking system. The word progressive is used. I wish they wouldn't use the word progressive because I think it's a huge misuse of it.
Uh-huh.
But basically, they'll it's kind of a first come first served basis for letting people talk. But if you've already spoken, or if you're of a minority, you'll get priority in the queue, basically, for when you're being recognized to speak.
I see.
And the more minority labels you can, I guess, post, the more priority you get in the queue as a result.
That makes me think of that one comedy sketch or whatever, and they were all sitting in a classroom, and you had a bunch of different people with different identities, and they were taking a test, and at the end of the test, you were graded on your identity. You were subtracted points if you had a oppressor identity, and you were added points if you had an oppressed identity.
I think I saw that video.
I think it was called The Classroom. So.
Yeah, and so there are some there are elements of intersectional, I guess, mindsets within DSA. But when you look at the actual discussion of topics, it pretty much all got down to the economic issues. And for the most part, I wasn't saying stuff that I would among people that I would see as actual socialism. And I was actually the recent meeting I attended was one where I was actually as a candidate for the state house where I live, and I mostly, I didn't use the word socialist to describe myself. I didn't use the word leftist to describe myself. I used the word progressive, and I basically just sort of talked in things in terms of a Keynesian economic logic, and that actually seemed to land with a lot of the people in the room there. I'm not really sure how socialist it is and how much the intersectional stuff is actually of great appeal to the socialists. It just may be the people who are already in DSA and not with the current new wave. I mean, they've had a huge spike in membership across the country.
Yeah.
And that could be good for the people who've been in DSA. They might see this good news or bad news, like all these newbies are going to change their organization. That's one thing I've noticed, and I'm not really sure how the dust is going to settle on all of that, so I'm going to keep an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that is something I've noticed, is that there's an effort, certainly, among this new left to incorporate the intersectional into the traditional conceptual framework of socialism, but it doesn't seem to be resonating as well as some of the people pushing for that might hope. I think that's just interesting to note. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of a tie-in. So you say that they're talking a lot about these economic issues, but I think with the intersectionality factor, it's kind of assumed within their ranks that these people are oppressed because of these systems, and then we have to change it using this economic system. I think it's a lot of assumed, like, intersectional identity is oppressed because of this system. We have to change this system. And they just talk about this system with the underlying notion, the underlying assumption that this person is oppressed.
Right, so you might say, like, an example of how they might look at it is, there's a common problem. Well, there's an increased rate of homelessness among the LGBT community, for example.
Yes.
And a lot of that is due to the fact that young LGBT people, they're not kids necessarily, but they're young adults who are disowned by their families when they come out. And we unfortunately live in a country where you can work full-time minimum wage and you can't necessarily pay for yourself to sustain yourself. So you end up homeless.
Yeah.
And so if you're more likely to be... it is well noted how much more millennials need to stay with their parents up into their 30s sometimes in order to be housed. This wasn't as true of the baby boomers. So you take that reality, and then you factor in the fact that, well, some of these millennials are going to be forced out by their parents, and it's much more likely to happen with ones who are LGBT because their conservative evangelical parents are not going to have that. And so you see an increased rate in LGBT homelessness. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that the socialists would look at that and say, because of the oppressive nature of a capitalist system, LGBT people have higher rates of homelessness. This is a form of oppression. And that by leveling the playing field and giving everyone a free house and doing all the other socialist things will end this LGBT oppression.
I think it's kind of that, and kind of like discrimination and disparities. Like, you see some kind of disparity there, and thus it implies discrimination. I've seen a lot of socialists talk about, like, housing. They talk about police brutality. And they just see, like, this primary thing happening. They just see the statistic, and then they assume, oh, it's because of racism. Oh, it's because of sexism. Oh, it's because of homophobia. And they don't really look into the details of that. They just kind of make that assumption.
And then, so this goes back to what we said a while ago, whereas they're recognizing perhaps real problems. Like, police brutality is a problem.
Certainly,
but their reaction to it is short-sighted, and the solution they propose is therefore a bit ham-fisted. And it's kind of bound to fail. And I think the example you raised with police brutality is perhaps a good one. I feel like, well, for one, a lot of the reactions to police brutality aren't necessarily based on data. A lot of it's, I think, just based on the fact that you can record something with your smartphone and put it on the internet, and when everyone starts doing this, and you get some of the bad deeds done by police officers, and some of these are just blatantly bad deeds. You see a lot of that. Some of them just look bad, though, or some of them is just it's open to debate, or they want to assume ill of the police, but it's understandable why police might have done something. So one example that comes to mind is the shooting of Philando Castile. Was that his name?
Philando Castile. Yeah.
Yes. They saw that as an example of, well, this cop was racist, and that's why he shot him. And this is how I look at it. One, if you're a policeman, you never know who the crazy person is. I mean, you're on the job long enough, you'll have seen some unpredictable stuff. And if you ever see, like, those anonymous Reddit comments, policemen of Reddit, like, what's the craziest thing? Like, it's amazing what some of these police officers will freely tell you about under an anonymity, right? And then you even see personal stories where it's not anonymous. People write, op-eds explaining, this happened to me once. There's crazy stuff that you see, and you'll never see it coming. You'll never predict it, no matter how long you're on the job. So they're never totally relaxed.
Well, yeah, so like, being a police officer is, like, the most dangerous job in America. Right. Like, you can get shot doing a traffic stop.
Right, like, and that just increases, because even if you come into a situation with good intentions, there are people who will, as soon as they see a policeman, react aggressively, because they'll assume that the policeman is there for them, and that guy just might be getting a coffee, and you happen to be there, and so policemen, wherever they go, are potentially just walking into danger, and that's just something that isn't true of most of the population. So they can never totally be calm. They always do have to be on some level of alert. So what I saw in Philando Castile's situation is this: he said the word gun while reaching for something in his pocket or whatever. And, he was trying to inform the officer, oh, I have a gun, right? I just want you to know this, right? But yeah, he did it, he timed it, and I don't want to blame Philando for this.
No,
but
certainly, yeah.
I do think, just from a pragmatic point of view, it was not wise to do that. You don't reach for something while uttering the word gun to a policeman. You just are increasing the chances that a negative reaction will occur.
Yes.
And I think that's basically what happened there. This wasn't I don't know that we have good evidence to think that this was a guy who was a racist actor and an extension of a racist system necessarily. I'm not saying that it's impossible that such a situation exists, but I don't look at that and necessarily see that that's what happened. It's extremely unfortunate what happened, and it's possible that he was racist. I mean, but it seems much more likely that a guy said the word gun while reaching for something. He wasn't threatening the police officer, but it was an association of two things, of a word and an action that led to a certain type of escalation by the policeman. And so, I think socialists will look at something like that, and they'll see videos like where it's understandable that the police did what they did, but they don't want to see it that way. And so they have these very short-sighted things like, well, we need to completely change this about the way policing is done. Now there are some examples where the policemen are clearly wrong. They're clearly using excessive.
Like that one example of I think it was the female police officer that busted into the wrong apartment and shot the guy. Shot the black dude. I forget where that was. Let's see. I think it was Colorado police. But the police was trying to go into their own apartment. The policewoman was trying to go into her own apartment, and she found a black dude there, and she thought it was a home invasion, so she shot him. But apparently, she went into the wrong apartment, and that's a pretty
right. I mean, that's a shoot first, ask questions later mentality like that is not the right one to have. And one example that comes to me was that one in South Carolina where the policeman shot that guy in the back while he was running away, and that's murder.
Yes.
All right, and insofar as we can expose stuff like that, we should definitely adjust our protocols to try and resolve it. But I do think we need to have the ability to look at something like what happened with Philando Castile and say, look, this was a guy who made a very understandable mistake, and that I think the takeaway of such a situation is, what can we do better to ensure that we have a happy ending when we have encounters with the police? I don't think saying the word gun while you're moving your hands towards something is one of those things. I think that's the cautionary tale that we can get from Philando Castile. That's the real lesson I think we should focus on there. Other shootings, the lesson is different, but on that case, that's the lesson. It's be very mindful of what you do when you interact with the police. I mean, I've had interactions with the police where they have confronted me on something because they wanted to know what was going on. And I've always been very careful not to do anything to make them want to draw their weapon on me. And having something of a military background myself, I do have an idea of what those things might be that could provoke someone with a gun. I think, and unfortunately, that's the society in which we live. We are not so advanced and enlightened that we can do without armed enforcers of the law to keep the peace.
So I think it's a two-faceted solution in this case when it comes to the police. I think police kind of need to not be so trigger happy. So you have to train. I think that you have to kind of train them better, but you also have to train society in a way like keep your hands at 10 and 2. Say yes sir, no sir. Like only reach when they tell you to reach. Just like be as respectful, respect their authority as much as possible, and you'll most likely get out. Like if they do something like truly evil, if they like give you a ticket or arrest you, like then that's a bad cop situation. So long as you follow the precautions and like if you follow the precautions and someone does something evil like arrest you, you can deal with that later. But that didn't escalate into something bad of like you got shot.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why it's important that you mention what you did, and why I think just at a fundamental level, this is why the socialists feel what they do. Because you look at their prescriptions they had for an economic system. It's focused on the system and the collective and what's wrong with it, and it shies away from individuals taking responsibility for what they can do. Right? That's not just the logic they're applying to economic systems. We see it as to more socially minded systems, like you might say is the case with policing.
Mm-hmm.
And they say like, well, the system's wrong, the policing system's wrong, maybe it's racist, if not, it's just too violent. But there are also things we can do as individuals to mitigate the number of deaths that come from police encounters, like not saying the word gun while you're reaching for something. Another thing you could do is, like you said, don't antagonize the police. Why would you antagonize someone with a gun? Would you antagonize any other person with a gun?
Exactly.
If not, why would you do that with a policeman? Would you antagonize a member of ISIS with a gun? Would you antagonize the mugger who has drawn his gun on you? No. Treat a policeman like you would a mugger in that case. If only because they have a gun, because that is the decisive similarity there.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is similar to what Sam Harris has said. Is like with the police, there's a gun on the table. In all cases, whether you have a gun or you don't, the policeman does. And as long as there's a gun on the table, and that gun has a specific purpose in keeping the peace, there are certain logical steps you always have to take, such as cooperating. And if the police are wrong, you can hopefully rectify that through your day in court, by suing and saying violated rights or violated some sort of due process, yada yada yada. But that's really the most effective way to go. Getting yourself killed doesn't prove anything, and so that means there's some level of just individual responsibility to be cautious and to understand the nature of policing and the dangers it entails, and how the policeman himself or herself is an individual too, and they are trying to follow the protocols of the police book, we might say, while also having to restrain the survival protocols of the human genome, which is not as easy to do as we might think. And I guess that really comes to the heart of it is a lot of socialist thought isn't realistically trying to tackle what is human nature and factor it into the solutions and use it as a tool rather than ending up crashing into it as an obstacle. I feel like with markets, you are able to take human nature and turn it into a force for good, for growth, by aligning the interests of the self and the individual with the interests of the whole.
Oh yeah, certainly, exactly with that. Like with I was actually talking to a socialist guy that I went to one of the Young Democratic Socialist meetings at the beginning of the semester so I could get to be able to talk with them, maybe set up a debate, something along those lines. And unfortunately, they figured out who I was and they kicked me out of like their group chats and stuff, which was it was unfortunate. But I still stayed in contact with this one guy, and he's like super nice. But I did ask him about this human nature thing, and I don't exactly remember what the response was, but it's like a thing of, is human nature like selfish? Is it selfless? And how does that go into play of like how people treat other people? Because that's how like our economic system will be at play. I think like with the case of capitalism, if people are selfish, they're trying to maximize their own gains. In a capitalist system, if you're trying to maximize your own gains, you have to like sell your product to people to be successful. I don't know how that would necessarily play out in a socialist. Well, I guess in a socialist thing, you just get yourself elected leader and kill everyone else off and just rule the world.
Well, that is one thing I've often wondered, and I've seen some people in DSA note this. Like they want to. I mean, some have come out and said we want to make material equality between or among all people, and I really don't know how you would really.
Was that material is that like equity? So like equality of outcome?
They're talking about equity, yes. They're talking about equity. And to me, one, I don't know. I don't really know how you would do that. And two, if you did that, I don't think people would be very happy with it. And I think any system you have for government, for an economy, or just for a philosophy or whatever, for any kind of overarching norms that you want to advocate, you do need to think about, well, how does it align with human nature? Because this is the way I see it, right? We create these solutions as a response to an excess of suffering and a shortage of pleasure in the world. And so we're trying to fix that shortage while reduce that excess. And what makes us happy and what makes us unhappy is the result of human nature. It's the way most of us are generally inclined to behave and feel. And while there's a great deal of variation of that, there's far more overlap. We're all unique, but we're a lot less unique than we'd like to think. And that homogeneity means that there are some systems you can do that are fairly workable that most people will be okay with. Like, for example, most people are okay with democracy as opposed to monarchy. Because that's a system that aligns well with human nature, right? Our incentives feed into that. We all have a stake in it that we didn't have under monarchical systems. Where monarchical systems were successful in the past was, if you look, say, at a medieval context, the main problem of the day was you had pillagers coming in, oftentimes the Vikings, coming in and killing people and taking their stuff. I need to do something about that. So there was a feudal system that was set up, a set of social and cultural obligations from vassal to lord, whereby they kept the pillagers out. People actually had some stuff to hold on to. They weren't being robbed of their grain and of their cloth and of their stone and just. This all sounds like very mundane stuff, but that was about as good as their stuff was back in the day, right? And it was very useful.
Exactly.
So monarchical systems align with incentives then. As we got to more current times, like toward, like, say, the French Revolution, it wasn't, the monarchical systems were no longer serving that purpose. They were instead using their position quite abusively. And at that point, people in the West began to say, I don't want this anymore. And then so the push for democracy began to take shape. And it wasn't always pretty, but we did finally get there in the West. And I think that's sort of the same thing we need to look at with communist systems. Is it solving actual problems of pain and pleasure as humans actually feel them? And I feel like when my ability to offer something to you in exchange for something I don't have from something that I have, like, that gives me a certain kind of freedom. Like, that I can say, well, I'll do this if you do this for me. If you can get me this thing I wouldn't otherwise have. Like, that's useful for me. My ability to trade with you allows me to not only improve my life, but improve my life as I want it to be improved. Like,
well, I mean, it improves both parties. Like, these consensual transactions, like if I wanted to trade a pencil for I don't know, a tissue or something, we'll both be better off because we have the things that we want.
Right, and if you want to insist on material equality, it's like, some people are happy with different amounts of money, right? Some people, you give them more money than they might have, they might not be happier for it. And some people, if they have less, they might actually find that this is something in which they're better able to function. If you look at material equality as beyond simply just money, it's like, do we all want the same amount of wall art in our houses, right? What if some of us don't want wall art in our houses, right? Some of us want different wall art in our houses, right? These are the variations where, when you try to tally it up, making equity an actual enforceable reality, it seems to be impossible, just because at what point is it congruent with the way human nature manifests itself?
Well, I think it's like, this is Karl Marx, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. People have different needs. So I think you were going on about this a little bit, like people have different needs. People might need this thing. They might need more food. And it's kind of hard to get that same level of equity when people need different things. And that just leads to a system of like, oh, I need this, or I need that, or I need that. Oh, we've run out of stuff. We can't give you this. So we're just going to give you these rations, whatever we can help, like, equally. So some people will be, like, screwed. Some people won't be screwed. But in the end, everyone's quote-unquote equal.
Mm-hmm. Right, but that sort of seems to be like a nominal equity. And it's not even the equity that the socialists seem to want to achieve. What do you say?
So, well, when you talk about when you're talking about equity, the socialists want equity in the end. They want everyone to be equal. They want everyone to be well off. I feel like they're trying to argue for equality of opportunity, not equality for outcome, but it's kind of manifesting itself in equality of outcome. But people have different outcomes that best suit them. So one outcome for one person won't be the best outcome for another person. So, like, I don't know, if we're trying to ration books, and some guy doesn't like books, he gets a book, but some guy that doesn't like books, he gets a book, he's just whatever. You have another guy who just gets one book, he wants more books, and he doesn't get more books because that's all the rations that we have. You have one guy that's just kind of screwed off because he didn't get to, he's just given this and he's not given the choice of, I want more books, I'm going to go make more books. No, you just get this one book because we're equal.
Right, and that is the thing there. It's like, how do you sort that out? And I don't even know if there's within socialist circles that they've really maybe settled how they would do that. There's another issue, I think, where socialism doesn't necessarily align well with human nature, and we haven't really come out and said this, but I think this is implicit in the construct, is there's no private property. And again, if you don't have something to call your own, a lot of human liberty sort of evaporates at that point.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
So let's look at it just a basic right in American democracy, which is the freedom from search or seizure without a warrant, right? So the idea that your house is your house, and you have a certain amount of safety in that house until the police can get a lawful warrant, is contingent on the fact that your house is your house. If the house belongs to the state, right, within American legal framing, the justification for a warrant disappears immediately. We don't need a warrant because, I mean, like if you're in a public building, they don't need a warrant to come get you out of it because it's not your place. But they do need that for privately owned areas. And if everything now belongs to the state in the pursuit of equity, you lose that protection. And then you can see how you have some abusive governments like what you saw with the Soviet Union. And then there's, even if you just look at something smaller than that, right? One thing I do in my free time is I make art. And I'm trying to work on it more, and I do it digitally on MS Paint, but I'd like to do prints on canvas that I could give to people. Now, that's costly. It's not something I'm going to be able to do until I myself am richer, but if I could make a painting for someone, and let's say my sister, here's a painting I made for you, right? The fact that it is mine, and I can give it to her, and it remains her as a gift, as part of my close relationship with my sister, is a nice thing. The guarantee of that disappears in a socialist society where everything is owned by the state. So, well, this isn't yours to give, and we think the state could actually use it for that. Well, so we'll take that.
Or they conscript you to give art to others.
Right, and I now don't have time to make art for people that are near and dear to me. That's pretty shitty, I'm just going to say. And that doesn't align well with human nature. What is so great about socialism that my ability to do nice things like that for the people I love is now taken from me?
Yeah, exactly. I think I remember hearing this a little bit ago. Countries that respect private property rights tend to do better and are a lot more free, and they have a lot better quality of stuff. And they don't turn to communist crapples. But I think a lot of the socialism and capitalism dynamic has a lot to do with positive and negative rights. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. I don't know if I could articulate it well, and I don't even necessarily know how that the audience would necessarily. So why don't you just go ahead and outline it, just so everyone's on the same.
Yeah, so negative rights, I'll start with negative rights. Negative rights are the rights of others to not interfere. Let's see, I saw a video from, I forget where it was called. It was, hold on a second. Aeon Scoble at Bridgewater State University. So a negative right is the right to, negative rights are ones that people have a negative duty of non-interference. So in the case of, you have free speech, you have the right to self-defense, you have the right to private property. People can't interfere and give those things to you. So they can't give you a platform, but they also can't take your speech away. And then you have positive rights, which are something is owed to you. So that's typically associated with healthcare. That's associated with given an actual platform to speak. So if you were to look at the right to free speech, the negative right to free speech is I can say whatever I want so long as I'm not censoring anyone, so long as I'm not trying to attack someone. And then the positive right aspect of that is someone has to give me a platform. So I am owed a platform to promote my speech. And that there is an element of force in that positive right. And you were talking about this a little bit. So with your art, you're kind of, I said that if someone had the positive right to your art, you're forced to come up with art for that person. There's an element of force involved. That's what the socialists want. They think that healthcare is owed to them. They think that education is owed to them, but someone has to provide that for them. You have to have the government provide this healthcare service for you or this education for you. And what do? They raise taxes on people. And then you have to hire teachers, and then you have to hire doctors and surgeons to serve these people for them. And essentially, I don't like saying this because it's kind of a straw man, or it's kind of I wouldn't say weak, but I'll just say weak. It's essentially slavery. You're conscripting people to provide a service for you forcibly without their consent.
Right. And to an extent, you might say we're all in some way slaves to each other, because in order to get anything, in order to make in this world, we have to be willing to put in an amount of labor, produce something of value. So there's that, but that's more of slavery in an abstract armchair sense.
I wouldn't even say the consensual agreements are slavery, because you can always opt out. You could always opt out of any kind of transaction so long as it's consensual. If I want to trade a pencil for your tissue, there has to be some sort of agreement for us to trade between the pencil and the tissue. And if I don't think that one tissue is enough for my one pencil, I want two tissues, I can always opt out. There's no element of force there. There are two parties consenting between wanting to trade with each other.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes good sense. So yeah, that's one thing is when you take away necessary liberties that are in large part tied to the concept of private property, you do effectively get something akin to a slavery system, much like serfdom was effectively a slavery system.
Yes.
Even though it's not textbook slavery, it effectively manifested in a way. Hence why it resulted in things like the French Revolution, because people had enough of it. And the next thing that I think is standing out is we've talked about how socialism's weakness in many ways is how it cannot grapple with human nature. There is one thing that is coming that is, in many ways, seems to be rendering the debate between socialism and capitalism obsolete. And Andrew Yang has talked a lot about it, and that's automation. So his basic premise is, as jobs go away and aren't replaced, and we lose a source of income for people who we need to do something to keep the flow of money going, so that the businesses that are now using robots to make these goods still have a consumer base to sell the goods. So the logical extension of this trend, though, is that all labor will be automated, and it'll just be human beings being human beings. And I don't know if you would describe what our solution to that issue is as a capitalist system or socialist system or something that transcends the two. But that's an issue that we're facing, because on the one hand, automation is consistent with human nature in that it respects the fact that you can get a machine to do something more carefully and efficiently than a human. If we look at self-driving cars, for example, they're not going to result in nearly as many fatalities. So why wouldn't you automate the driving industry, for example? You'd kind of be a moral lunatic not to do that. At the same time, if we undermine our economic system, what are we going to do with all these people who still need to eat and be sheltered? And where their ability to eat and be sheltered is dependent on the steady income that these heretofore unautomated labor services they were able to provide were making possible. So I guess that's the thing. What do you think of the specter of automation that's looming? And I mean, Andrew Yang has proposed that we do a UBI as a potential fix, and that this is increasing the role of government, increasing the necessary baseline, I guess, to put it in terms that you might use, at least as Yang sees it, that this is a necessary step we're going to have to take to make sure that society actually does function, given the current trends. Do you think UBI is useful? And then, as all jobs go away, what do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not entirely unfriendly to the idea of universal basic income. I think that there is some utility in it for when automation becomes a force so unstoppable. I don't necessarily see that happening right now. Unemployment has stayed pretty much the same for the longest time, and we've had these massive developmental spikes in technology. I mean, you had this in the past too with I think we can go off of cars too. You had the horse and buggy at one point, and you had people displaced because you had an automobile. But with those jobs gone because of the horse and buggy, you had automobile jobs come in. Jobs that we had no idea existed in the past, just popped up out of nowhere. With automated cars, you're gonna definitely have some people be displaced, like truckers, but there's gonna be more. There are going to be different jobs to suit the automatic car industry. You're going to need programmers. You're going to need car designers to make it more aerodynamic or whatever. You're going to need testers. One idea that I thought is just, if you want to make money and you have an automatic car, just send your car out on the road to pick people up for you as kind of an automated Uber. That's a completely different way to make money. Just sending your car out nowhere to pick people up and they give you money. We didn't even think Uber was a thing for the longest time until it was a thing.
So essentially what you're saying is we could, the laborers, if they're clever enough, can simply become capitalists with no employees.
Essentially, yeah, you're your own boss. You just send your car out into the wild, and
that is an interesting notion of how we might view trade.
But
yeah, that is very good.
Yeah, but once again, I'm not unfriendly to the idea of universal basic income, but that would have to come at the cost of all the robots have taken everyone's jobs. And what do we do about that? I'd be friendly to universal basic income then, but I don't see that happening in the near future. I know Milton Friedman, he suggested a universal basic income with like a negative tax. So if like you hit if you're below a certain threshold, you're given money, and if people are above the threshold, they're having money taken from them, the negative income tax. I don't know necessarily how that plays out, but that's like an alternative an alternative to Andrew Yang's $1,000 a month for everyone. And honestly, I think that's like a pretty good. It's a better idea than the welfare system we currently have, I would say, because like it's just a straight $1,000 a month. That's all you get. If you lose it all, that sucks. And then you have all these different benefits like what is it? WIC, food stamps, all these different things that aren't doing the best, and people kind of like game the system that way, but you can't really game the system with like $1,000. You're just given $1,000 and that's it.
Right. Okay. So there are some things where individuals can make use of automation to enrich themselves, like you said, like the automated Uber, but it's still very much possible that's things like that aren't going to be on the table. So it does make the future less bleak, but some people don't have cars that they can have be their automated Uber as a form of passive income, effectively. And there are jobs that, so some of the very high skilled jobs, like the programmers.
I think with automation, you're seeing a change of job types. So there was a lot of more hands-on kind of jobs, but now that's being replaced by automation. So I guess you're moving from, blue collar to white collar. I think that's the right thing. You're moving from those types of jobs to the other types of jobs. So like instead of a construction type job, you're being moved to a desk job, a programmer type job.
Okay, well, I guess the necessary question is, what do we do when those forms of trade are automated as well? Because automation isn't just it's just making more complex hardware, but some of it's also software development and making smarter computers and AI so they're able to do things that previously only the human brain could do. And while a lot of it is pretty far off, it's not a future that we can dismiss or we think won't ever happen. I think we have every reason to think that AI that surpass humans in cognitive function will come up at some point as humans continue to improve their technology. It's just a matter of when. How soon do you think it's going to be? In 50 years or 100, right? Or 200?
Yeah.
And things like that will change the game, right? So there will be some jobs that disappear, and while you can send out your car to be your automated Uber for folks, things like that probably won't be in the hands of everyone who's a displaced worker. Some people will have something that they can't have as their automated form of passive income. And what do you do when that happens? I mean, you said you're open to the idea of UBI in a context like that, but part of me wonders if we get to that point where nobody's really doing any of their own labor anymore, if we really do have a coherent economic system anymore. Where the normal flow of money occurs, from in the form of purchase to to the bank account of the business, and into the payrolls of the employees, and back into purchases in that cycle.
Yeah, so this is starting to sound my philosophy class. I took it last semester, and it was a lot on this kind of, what if AI takes over? What are we going to do? What if they take all the jobs? What are we going to do in the meantime? And it's kind of hard to say. I've heard people say that, people will just do what they want to do. They'll take creative outlets. They'll like do art, they'll do music, they'll do dance, stuff along those lines.
So we'll all just be frolicking in the park all the time.
I don't know about that. I think people will try to find their own work. There are always going to be people who don't really like the new technology, so they'll stick with like actual people to deal with. Like people hate being dealt with on an automatic message system, or they dislike the self-checkout scanners. So they'll go.
Some people will want to be retro. Some people are.
Some people are going to be retro. I don't know what percentage that is, but you're going to have a bunch of people who want to be retro, who want to actually do some real work instead of frolicking in the park all the time. So
they want to feel like an artisan, basically.
What do you mean, feel like an artist?
Like an artisan.
Oh, an artisan. Yeah. They'll definitely. I think because like work is a pretty big part of people's lives. It keeps them occupied. It keeps them like doing something. Keeps them in like a regular schedule. And if they have nothing to do because of a job, they'll find something to do.
Right. I think I said this in a previous episode of the podcast, but pretty universally, whatever your personality type, the human brain seems to be obsessed with problem solving. It is first and foremost a problem solving machine, and this is because to survive, when our intelligence is our only advantage over other animals, which are typically faster and stronger, see better in the dark, hear better. If intelligence is what you've got, then you have to have a real emotional interest in solving problems and a sense of gratification doing it, because that's how you survive. That's how you navigate these issues. And we're sort of seeing the point now where we're no longer in the hostile hunter-gatherer environment where something could jump out and kill us at any moment. We've eliminated most of our natural environmental threats, and the sedentary nature of existence like that is troublesome to our brain that has evolved to respond to the things that will jump out and try to kill us, and our need to analyze it and outsmart it and develop complex solutions to it, right? Mm-hmm. That seems to be the fundamental issue. And so I guess the issue is like, one thing we do have to worry about is not only just the economic system, how it may fall apart with automation, but indeed what the effect on us culturally is, right? I think this everything we do to find meaning, to be creative, is an offshoot of this problem-solving function of the brain. Like when I do art, I'm effectively trying to solve the problem of how do I make something on Microsoft Paint look like something in real life. Mm-hmm. That's a problem that I have decided to solve. And when I finally do solve it, I have that aha moment or whatever, the satisfaction that comes from it. Things like that. You seem to be of the mind that automation, rather than being a specter, is going to be something that will just give rise to other forms of creative efforts. And while it might not result in new jobs per se under the traditional understanding of economies where labor is provided in exchange for some sort of wealth for sustenance, it'll free us up for basically a more fluid type of human interaction where...
I don't think it's going to change like humanity's kind of nature in a sense. Like once we do hit that stage of every job is taken by robots, I definitely think that there's going to be people that are going to be retro. There are going to be people that want to do something that's worthwhile, that's like kind of similar to work. You're going to have those people because people will just be, I guess, sitting on the sidelines doing nothing and wasting their time. And they'll just be, the alternative is I'm just going to be sitting on my butt all day watching Netflix while my robot butler helps me out doing this stuff. I don't think a lot of people are going to be doing that. A lot of people are going to be trying to find like some kind of initiative to do something new.
Or at the very least, we're gonna go out and want to feel the grass under our feet sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, this has all been very fascinating stuff, I have to say. And we're coming up toward the end of the time here. I want to give you a moment now, just sort of express your final closing thoughts on what we've discussed so far.
Yeah, certainly. So with socialism, I don't think we even discussed this at all. I think socialism, I believe it comes from a place of compassion. Like, you obviously have, you're very concerned about these people in poverty, these people who are being exploited, these people who are being targeted by police, all these different things, and you're trying to do your best to help them, which I can understand. I'm not generally the type of person that assumes malintent. I believe that you believe what you believe for a good reason. But when these socialists, these lefties, try to come up with solutions for that, when you try to like solve people not getting healthcare, people not getting educated, you tend to focus on one group and not the group, and not everyone as a whole. You kind of leave a bunch of people behind to help the one group, and that doesn't make anything better. And you only go for a short-term solution rather than a long-term, grandstanding solution. I think the best thing in cases like poverty, I think in cases like police brutality, in case of people not getting healthcare, education, I think that there's a big need for a cultural shift, a big mindset change. Like, you're not owed this, but you can look to your community towards help. You can look to your friends for help. You can look to your family towards help. You shouldn't be relying on the government. You shouldn't be relying on the state or like the majority of people to be able to take care of you. You need to be able to form connections with people that will help you out. But people just want those really short-term solutions to things that just won't fix anything.
Okay, well, very well put and very well argued. Thanks for coming on, Nate. It's been a delight.
Yeah, it's been great.
I hope to see you share some more of your content. You do have a YouTube channel. Would you mind just sharing the name of that before we close out?
Just look me up, N8 Blueberry. So N, the number 8, and the Blueberry. Or you can look up What Do They Think? I have my first episode right now with my friend Alex. We talk about climate change, foreign policy, and abortion from a libertarian perspective. It's a really great conversation.
All right, great. Well, I hope everyone takes a look into his stuff, because I have, and it's been pretty interesting. It's not just him tooting his own horn. It is interesting stuff on his channel. But with that, thank you for coming, Nate, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
All right, you as well.